Why should China top a policy agenda in the foreign sphere for a Biden administration? My name is Tony Saich, and I'm the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. In terms of how Beijing views Biden's election, I think the attitude in China has been shifting. While many had presumed that they might find the Biden administration more amenable, I think they're coming to the conclusion that a Biden administration will be different, but equally as tough to deal with as a Trump administration. It would not have the unpredictability, but I think they have a sense that the Biden administration might try to build those international coalitions and might also put pressure on China, not only around its business practices, creating a level playing field, but also on questions of human rights protection and religious freedom. I think there's a general consensus in Washington now that China presents the most significant geopolitical and strategic challenge to any administration moving forward. Essentially, that I think is the commonplace starting point. However, there are considerable differences about how to deal with the way that challenge is assessed. Should it be through competition? Should it be through confrontation? Or should it be with containment? Or should it be a mixture of any one of those three? Now, in terms of advising a Biden administration as it comes in, I think there are three basic principles that one can bear in mind. The first is, rather than simply banning Chinese organizations and Chinese apps, one should push for reciprocity. Remember, it was China that began decoupling by banning Facebook, Google, and other apparatuses from the West. The second principle is it's very difficult to go alone in meeting the challenges and demands from China. And I think a Biden administration should seek to try and build alliances of the aggrieved and the willing to put pressure on China to conform to those obligations which it has said it is committed to, particularly after it entered the World Trade Organization. That is the one thing China fears most. It doesn't like feeling it's being ganged up upon and would rather act one-on-one rather than in multilateral environments. And thirdly, I think one should look for those areas where cooperation might be conceivable. And I would think there in the realms of new global public goods, dealing with climate change, dealing with pandemics, dealing with the challenges to the ocean, and so forth.
In terms of what the new administration should know about China's stance on climate change, my name is Edward Cunningham, and I'm the Director of China Programs at the Ash Center. Broadly speaking, peak emissions are targeted in 9 years, so by 2030, carbon neutrality targeted by 2060, so about 40 years. And that's largely through the development of carbon markets and other forms of green finance and upgrading environmental energy technologies, reducing energy demand, diversifying energy supply. So those sort of broad outlines of China's climate stance is, I think, quite known. The reality, of course, is no one really knows the details, as the 14th five-year plan is currently quite broad, as always, and will only really be known in more detail next year. So I think at this current juncture, probably the new administration really should try to maintain a laser focus on actually a growing dichotomy, and that's between China's climate record at home and climate record abroad. At home, progress has been mixed, right? Progress in the form of China developing the world's largest wind and solar and electric vehicle markets, among others, but also much of that's mitigated by the fact that it continues to consume, half the world's coal and produces well over double the carbon emissions of the United States. Abroad, Chinese companies continue to build a vast capacity of fossil fuel infrastructure, despite these points of progress at home, and really more limited renewable infrastructure. So I think that paradox is what should inform US climate action moving forward, at least vis-a-vis China. In terms of what would be a useful first step when developing the U.S. plan on the climate side, or a proposal for any type of actions to combat climate change vis-a-vis China. In some ways, the optimist in me believes that these challenges of the global commons and climate in particular may be actually one of the few arenas that can benefit from heightened competition in one sense. And so successful, I think, U.S. climate actions towards China probably will need to play out on two levels, both domestic and international, right? Domestically, the U.S. has now come to fully embrace that it systematically has to compete with China in the sustainability space. And so if you're not a major market for electric vehicles, for advanced storage, for sophisticated demand response and efficiency standards, you can't lead, right? You can't really compete. I think that pivot domestically first will be noted in Beijing, and perhaps more importantly, within Chinese investment funds, energy and infrastructure companies, and then other corporate actors. I think internationally, when it comes to global governance, we can combine that competition with some limited engagement. Are building so much abroad that is fossil. I think here we really do need to, particularly given the UN SDGs, really need to have a much more well-resourced and active development finance corporation, right, to provide some alternative financing in the developing world, particularly in areas we care about in South Asia, Southeast Asia. And at the same time, really focus in the G20 on what the goals of a multilateral world can be under clearly competing regional trade agreement reality, right, that we're continuing to walk into. And then lastly, when it comes to trade, I think the U.S. probably needs to be smart in how and where we compete. So ironically, trade may be an area where we can get some fast short-term traction, right? So if it's jobs that we care about, particularly given the current crisis, well, there are not many jobs in the manufacturing of solar panels, yet many jobs in the installation of solar panels, right? And that's demand is fueled by low prices. So I think the phase one deal actually between the US and China began to lower a lot of these tariffs in a way that was quite logical. That should be accelerated. And then those openings to reduce trade tariffs in these areas where we know we shouldn't be competing through tariffs, I think that will be welcomed by Beijing, but also create some momentum, right? That can then aid efforts to address other issues like subsidies of fishing fleets and other important threats to the global commons.